On this week's episode of 90 Degrees, weighing recent data heavier than season long data, why quarterback play is down around the league, and how to interpret coach speak and turn it into betting opportunities. That and more on today's episode of 90 Degrees. Welcome to the 90 Degrees podcast, where we take an inside look into the sports betting industry. I'm your host, George Sofidis, and I'm excited because today I've got Sam Hoppen, data scientist for Fantasy Pros, joining me. Sam, thanks for doing this.
George, thanks for having me on. I'm very humbled to be on. There are a lot of people I look up to who have been on this feed before, so very honored to get to join that list.
I'm glad to have you on. I like to follow a lot of data scientists, people who put out charts that I just find interesting tidbits, and I'm like randomly will like stuff so I can revisit in the future. And this is how I got into like following Arjun Menon and Tej Seth, and I've had them on before, and I'm like, you know what? I think it just got to the point where like I just kept seeing your name pop up in my feed, and I liked what you were creating. I think I just messaged you like, man, I really like the data you put out. You want to join me on the pod because I'd love to talk football with you. So I'm thankful for the work you do, and I'm thankful to have you.
Well, thank you very much. I very much look up to Tej and Arjun as well. They put out great content and are both still in undergrad or have just graduated from undergrad. So they've certainly set themselves up for success here down the road.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty good at identifying rising stars, and I think those two are going to be ultra successful in their careers. I want to ask you, what was your introduction to football? I'm in Canada, in Toronto, and it's not our national sport. You know, hockey is what like is beat into us. We had the Blue Jays young. Football's not something you get into until a few years later. It's usually like a family member introduces it to you. What age are you when football becomes a thing in your life?
A couple of years in, I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and there's famously not much in Green Bay outside of the Packers, cheese, and beer. So from a very young age, grew up rooting for the Packers, going to games, and enjoying football. Like many people, watching it on Sundays with your dad and getting to enjoy. And I think the earliest memory I have of watching a football game was Brett Favre's Monday Night Football game against the Raiders after his dad had passed, and just him lighting it up in an emotional game. So a lot of good Packers memories, fortunately for me, in my life so far, but have been watching football ever since and have been enjoying it just as much.
I had a question for later, but I want to jump it up because you said that, and that's a game like that's a moment that is ingrained in me. And I remember, I think it was Javon Walker was one of the receivers at the time, and I remember him an interview clip of him saying, "We knew for him to play today, we are gonna catch," and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about this. We are gonna catch anything in our vicinity today. And like legit, everyone was making spectacular catches. It's one of those moments where like you actually fall in love with the game of football and why it's so good. What do you love about football? What's your attraction to it? Part of it for me is like chess meets like a physical sport where like attrition is important, and who can assert their physicality, but also coaches who are scheming up each individual play as opposed to free flowing play. What attracts you to the sport of football?
That's such a good question because I'm sure it's different for everyone, but it's, at least today, like it's that there's so much to learn about it, and you're never going to really be an expert or like know everything about it. And things are changing, whether it's scheme, obviously the fourth down decision making stuff nowadays. Like there's just so much to it. And then you talked about it, like the game itself brings so much emotion. I keep seeing clips nowadays of the players talking on the field and in sort of the mic'd up situations, and they're just like out there having fun. Like you obviously see them tussling with each other every once in a while and stuff like that, but it's really like they're just out there having fun and playing a game. And it's, I think, super fascinating to analyze. Obviously, it being the biggest sport in the country helps because you have so many smart people interested in the sport and analyzing it, dissecting it, trying to find different ways to make it more interesting. I think over the last several years or so, I've sort of veered away from, like, not that I'm not a Packers fan anymore, but just being a fan of the NFL and fan of football and not attaching my highs or lows to one specific team. But watching the Monday Night Football game last night between the Chiefs and the Eagles, just seeing Patrick Mahomes make some of those throws, it's absurd. And then I went to Wisconsin, UW Madison for undergrad, and I remember just having chills being in Camp Randall on a Saturday night and watching them play football. Like, it's such a fun atmosphere. I think a lot of people can obviously relate to it, but there's something different about football. Obviously, there's the any given Sunday mantra, which makes it interesting as well.
Yeah, it's to me like the level of intelligence that goes into football. I think the IQ of the people in the organization, I think it operates at the highest level of any sport. You
Yeah.
said something that I found interesting. You said like not just being a fan of your own team. I am a fan of organizations moving in the right direction or like making a lot of like so when you said Eagles KC, I know your mind was on the field and my mind was I love how Howie Roseman builds his roster and how and their approach to like draft premium positions in the draft and don't be afraid to trade or sign a vet that will put you over the top. Like I like when organizations are moving in the right direction and doing a lot of smart moves. It doesn't even have to be a Miami. I just am a fan of smart organizations. But conversely, I can't understand the level of some organizations and their ineptitude and why they think it would work. That's part of the fascination. I am very much as I love the on the field product, the roster building aspect of football is probably my favorite thing. I would like being in a war room is I don't even have to be a general manager. Let me sweep the floor in the war room. I just want to be inside a draft war room one day in my life just to experience what it's like in the first round of a draft.
Yeah, and it's one of those things because we all can make assumptions about why a team did this, why a team did that, and without actually being in the room, like, we're never going to get that level of insight. And there's, you know, in a war room specifically, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen people who are like there and totally understand the logic behind what's driving that decision. Like, I was not a fan of the Jordan Love draft pick at the time, but these guys are also like very smart. Like, you got to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and understanding that Rodgers had been on the decline. Like, they needed to sort of look towards the future given his performance. And, at the time it was frustrating, especially with the way he went out and played, but they had their logic and reasoning for it. And it's a little frustrating because they don't have to explain that logic to the fans or whatever. Like, obviously the on-field results are theoretically going to show for themselves, but it would be, yeah, it would be fascinating just be a fly on the wall and understand sort of how they're thinking, the conversations that they're having too, and just getting that level of insight, which is, I think, why Hard Knocks is such a fascinating show. I mean, I know it's lost its luster a little bit, but it to still get that level of detail and sort of the behind the scenes look at some things is always fascinating.
I want to talk to you about Pinnacle. Pinnacle is the world's sharpest sports book and available to bettors in Ontario. Find out what the pros have known for 25 years. Everyday competitive odds, your trusted sports book. Bet smart, bet Pinnacle. Must be 19 plus in Ontario. Please play responsibly. Not available in the US. Now back to the show. Yeah, and I love the social media clips whenever like Cowboys bring out why did they chose Mozzie Smith and who it was between. I love that stuff where the Bills deciding to draft Dalton Kincaid and they didn't want to trade down. The Jaguars were actively trading down and they didn't want somebody to jump them for the tight end. Um, you know, the Packers got criticized for drafting Jordan Love, but there's a reason why the Packers had two starting quarterbacks for 34 years. They drafted Favre's replacement and groomed him to learn the offense. And then like a team like Miami, who I'm a fan of, had been searching for Dan Marino's replacement for 20 years. And like smart organizations understand, and it's not just quarterback. When the Eagles know that they're eventually going to lose a couple defensive tackles to age or free agency, Javon Hargrave to free agency, and Fletcher Cox is getting up there in age, they're drafting Jordan Davis and the big defensive tackle, what's his name, Jalen Carter. Even if it's not an immediate need, they understand the long term aspect of you're going to have to fill in key roles and drafting guys to replace the guys who are going to be
Right.
ending up leaving your roster. When do you decide, you know what? I love sports so much. I want to get some sort of job in this field. I want to pursue a career path because a lot of people, I think they have that aspiration as kids, but then eventually they're like, oh, reality, I got to get a normal job. Sports will just be something I watch on the side. There's very few people who say, no, I actually want to do this for a living.
That's a fascinating question, and it requires a little bit of backstory. So when I was in high school, I was, thinking about what I wanted to study in college, at university, and I was very interested in marketing. I was very interested in sports, and so I thought, let's put together the two and do sports marketing. And I had done some informational interviews, and I had talked with someone who worked in sports marketing at Wisconsin, and he was like, when you're in sports marketing, your life is sports. Like you're doing it 24/7. You're hosting people for sponsorship, things like that. And you can't just like go home and use sports as your way escape from work or outlet, right? Like it's your life, so you're always living it. And that initially like scared me off from it. And I ended up going into corporate America, doing some marketing stuff, still did some, sports analysis on the side, was playing fantasy football, all that sort of stuff. And again, was using it as an outlet. And then a couple of years ago, was actually applying for some MBA programs and got rejected by the two that I had applied for, and started taking, thinking about what I could do to sort of boost my portfolio, or I guess profile, if I wanted to get into that in the future. And for some reason, I thought about doing some coding and followed some of the people that you mentioned, Ben Baldwin, most significantly, Parker Fleming, doing some sports analytics stuff on Twitter, and just sort of gravitated towards doing some coding around the atmosphere of sports. And one thing turned into another. Like I started a master's in data science because I realized I wanted to make that career switch, and then was fortunate enough to sort of be in the right place in the right time to get offered a full-time role with 4for4 and BetSperts, which started my full-time career in this industry. That was, gosh, 2 years ago now, and then made the switch to Fantasy Pros earlier this year. But it was one of those things where I realized that, one, I love sports enough that I won't get sick of it, if you will. And I had the opportunity to work on different sports instead of just football. So it gave me a bit of a mix between, doing football 24/7, 365, getting to work on some basketball, some golf stuff, but also sort of realizing that it's I had hobbies outside of sports to be able to focus on and use as an outlet, as I've said. But it was one of those things where I don't know if I ever like really realized that I was sort of trending that way. And again, I got very, very lucky. I'm very uh very lucky to be where I am today, because it's a competitive field, and there are a lot of people who want to be in it. So it's there's no one right journey to get into it, but there are certainly avenues to doing so.
All right, you get the opportunity at 4for4 and BetSperts. Is that the start of your betting and fantasy, or were you doing that way before joining them?
I was playing fantasy football. I mean, I've been playing fantasy football as long as I can remember. It wasn't until probably shortly before joining them where I started doing betting stuff, betting on the side. It was around the time when betting got legalized in Illinois, which is where I lived, and started again following some sharper people to learn about how it works and things like that. And that was my sort of first foray into it, and then realized I wanted to start doing some more analysis and tool building centered around fantasy football and sports betting.
And is it player props, or are you still like, are you looking at sides and totals and betting other stuff as well?
It's mostly player props. I mean, I sides and totals is, as you know, a very difficult thing to beat, and so the overlap too with player props and fantasy football is pretty big. So when I'm doing my weekly analysis for my fantasy football content, it's a pretty easy sort of lift and shift in terms of the analysis to say, okay, I think player X has a good matchup. His usage is looking good. I think he's going to do well in his fantasy for his fantasy output this week, and then sort of shifting that to, okay, how does that translate to his prop markets, things like that.
Sure. So you're measuring usage, how good they do something, who their opponent is. What about coach speak? Because there's a great account, but it even before then, people have been watching coaches pressers to find out exactly what they're saying about players. And I've talked to Adam Levitan about this, and he said you have to be careful with some coach speak. Is when a coach is directly asked about a player, it's almost always like, yeah, we got to give him the ball more, right? And he goes, sometimes that's noisy, but when a player's brought up unprompted, oftentimes some of that is really strong signal. Um, the Calvin Ridley stuff was fascinating. Benjamin Solak brought out some really, really good stats on how they've been misusing him, or not, doing actively trying to free him. And Doug was asked about it, and he's clearly admitted that they probably had to do more to get Ridley. Some people were like, all right, this is a Ridley week. And if you bet him and you bet his ladders, you were really rewarded by it, especially against the Titans, who are also a pass funnel defense. So my question is, you have your projected numbers. How much do you weigh in coach speak when approaching this?
Yeah, it's it's like Adam said, like you gotta pick and choose the right spots to apply it, and thinking about it, or I guess listening to the right coaches too. Like to your point, like if a reporter asks Doug Peterson, why is this going on with Ridley? He's going to talk about Calvin Ridley. So it's not necessarily him going out of his way to say, you know, we're doing everything right, but we also need to get Calvin Ridley the ball. I think, and Ben's article was great, but I think there are other confounding factors too that could have gone into him having a big week. Like you mentioned, the Titans being a big pass funnel. The Titans don't play a ton of press coverage as well, which is something that Calvin Ridley had struggled against. So, whether you attribute what Doug Peterson said to Calvin Ridley's success, or Zay Jones being back, which I think the splits with him on and off the field for Ridley have helped the Jaguars sort of be able to move Calvin Ridley around the lineup and where they're getting him lined up. You got to take all of that context into consideration too. So I think it's one of those things where, again, you almost use it as a tiebreaker type thing where if you're, I guess, and this is more so from a fantasy football context, but if you're deciding between two players and one has sort of glowing remarks from the coach, like then maybe you go with him as a tiebreaker. Or if you're sort of looking for that one extra push to get this guy going, then I think you look at that. But it's all about context too, and I think the Coach Speak Index Twitter account that I think you're referring to it's been phenomenal. Like it's interesting to again essentially hold these coaches accountable, but they are really only going to talk positively about these players. Like they'll be critical at some points, but I mean, you haven't seen Robert Saleh say anything bad about Zach Wilson to this point, outside of him benching him this week. So it's one of those things where they have to be careful about what they're saying too, so that they don't burn bridges with the players in their building.
The easiest way to improve as a sports bettor is use multiple sports books and always get the best odds. We recommend using an odds comparison tool like BetStamp. BetStamp compares odds across every sports book for games, futures, and player props. Save time and money by checking BetStamp before you bet. Download the app today. If you're looking to sign up for a new sportsbook account, please check out the offers available at betstamp.app/circles off or hit the link in the description. If you sign up through this page, it helps support the show. Now back to the episode. Yeah, Sam, it's training camp reports. I don't think anybody in the history of the NFL has had a bad training camp. If it has, nobody
Yeah.
reports it because it's always this guy is looking great. Like we've seen, baby To. This guy looks like a monster in training camp, and it doesn't pan out. I want to ask you about weighing data, and I want to talk about sample size and weighing recent data versus season long data, and how do you value a more recent sample size of like say 4 games versus a season long data, putting like a decay on some earlier results, or if something has fundamentally changed. When Joe Burrow came back, Cincinnati's offensive data was kind of irrelevant, previous to that calf finally being 100%.
Mhm.
But it's also like the Packers. If you had been following the Packers up until the last few games, you might think of them as like an under team. But the thing we've learned in the last couple of weeks is this Jordan Love offense is finally starting to look good once it started getting healthy and Aaron Jones was back and all his receivers. And also, frankly, their defense has gotten a lot worse. Everybody's running the ball on them, and
Yeah.
there's that switch gets flipped where if you're not fast enough, you miss what's happening more recently. So, how do you weigh recent data? And this isn't overreacting to maybe one data point, but maybe trending data the last 3 or 4 weeks versus here's a season long sample size of 10. What's the fine process of the right mix of recipe of what you're looking for?
So I used to weigh, I think the 3 or 4 game sample size is a good sort of snapshot of a team's recent performance and tendencies. And I've started to weigh that snapshot a bit more heavily than the season long stuff, because there are so many injuries that happen. There are play calling, coaching changes that happen throughout the year, and you need to again put all of that into context. Like I feel like I'm saying putting it into context too much, but you're also looking at the opponents that they're playing and things like that. And where I think you have an edge in betting or fantasy football is maybe putting a little bit more weight towards even the 1 or 2 game sample sizes and trying to get out ahead of it becoming a trend for that team, as opposed to it just being the exception to the rule for that team. So, I think with the Burrow example, like there were the reports for him, I think, leading up to the San Francisco game where they were saying, like, you know, all the restraints are off. Like, he's good to go. This is the healthiest he's been in a long time. And I think they had already started throwing the ball just like a little bit more in the weeks prior. And it's set up for him to just sort of unload and then to have him drop back and pass a ton. And if you were early to that, you got rewarded a lot more heavily than 3 weeks down the road, once they're already passing a ton. The markets have caught up to him, the player values have caught up to the Bengals receivers and stuff like that. So I think it's more so not necessarily forgetting what happens earlier in the season, because that does matter, especially when a team has one set of players that were healthier in the year, and maybe they get them all back. Like, once Justin Jefferson returns for the Vikings, the player usage for Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson is going to change. So you can't, not that you can't use it, but you need to to consider that as well. And then they also don't have Kirk Cousins. So that said, I think again, these 2 or 3 game samples, like if we're in week 2 or 3 or 4, that's the only sample we have, and people are taking it as gospel. Like
Yeah.
it's all we have. So let's just make conclusions about what we've seen so far. You don't see people doing that once we have more data, which is fair to an extent, but I think there's a lot that can be gained from taking those more recent samples and weighing them more heavily.
For sure, and especially rosters that had a lot of turnover. It's reasonable to expect, or a scheme change in whole. Like
Mhm.
it's reasonable to expect that their play in weeks 8 to 12 are probably going to be a better indicator than the early growing pains. Right. I want to ask you about reputation because obviously guys who have a long career reputation is a lot more concrete, but sometimes we declare something about a player or a team with not such a large sample size, and there's opportunities I find to buck that when we put somebody in a box and are unwilling to understand the growth aspect of a position. How do you navigate when someone's reputation is better or worse than their actual results or output?
That's a really good question. I mean,
Is there any players like that you think somebody whose reputation is probably better than their actual output, and then somebody whose reputation is worse than the actual results they're getting? That you think that there's a skew where people are overrating or underrating a player?
I obviously he's hurt, but I think Kirk Cousins was criticized a little bit too harshly, and I think a lot of it is because of his performance in standalone games and it not being very good. Like he's a very good quarterback and like he plays well. I don't necessarily think he elevates a team quite like, Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow, guys like that, but he's certainly not as bad as guys like Zach Wilson. And people sort of talked about him like that. So I think part of it too is having watched the Netflix documentary and making Kirk Cousins like an actual person that made me like him a little bit more. But I do think he gets a worse rap than he deserves at this point. As far as the guys who are overrated, that's a really tough one. I'm like trying to think of some guys off the top of my head. I mean, it would be easy to say Brock Purdy because a lot of people think he's mounted up by the play callers he has, the skill possession players he has, but he's also, in my opinion, much better and a much better fit than Jimmy Garoppolo ever
Mm.
was in that offense. So it's it's a fine balancing act, and I think people take those over or under reactions a little bit too far sometimes, where they just dig their heels in on one specific take, and then a season, half a season goes by, and they're just picking apart stats that fit their narrative type thing. So those are the two guys I think that come to mind to me, and they're obviously pretty polarizing players, but I don't think match the complete narrative.
Well, you said a couple things that I find interesting. Kirk Cousins is, it's I think Arjun jokes to the Kirkulian tier, and we pretend like he's, Derek Carr esque, and I'm like, Cousins has a better upside than Derek Carr. And I also think his floor is far
Yeah.
better than Carr. So I've never liked that. I've always thought Cousins is closer to 10 than he is to 16, as is perceived, that he's a middle of the ground quarterback. What I was thinking for overrated is, and it usually comes in the form of running backs, but also I have an example of a wide receiver. When a player loses his burst, his juice, people, it takes a while for people to wrap their head around it. Like, who was the running back out of Arizona? I think it was David Johnson, and you could just tell the moment he lost his juice. Or Zeke Elliott, right? You could tell. Um, Dalvin Cook was an example last year. There are people who were watching. You're like, his rush yards over expected was near the bottom of the league last year, and I know his numbers still look good, his raw data, but that's because the O line is very good in Minnesota. And the guy like DeAndre Hopkins is a version of that this year for me, because he doesn't get open at all anymore. And it's not like he was always open before, but if he's not beating you on like contested catches, he doesn't get open. And I think sometimes people will take a long term reputation and still and take a lot longer to figure out that a guy maybe has lost his juice. Now, I say that I'm being a hypocrite because sometimes, you have the Derrick Henry for 2 years. I've been saying this guy's lost his juice, and I've been
You and
wrong.
me both.
Yeah, this year I'm right though. I mean, if you watch Ty J Spears behind the same circumstances, just looks like he has more burst in his body, right? But I think like there's something tangible about when you watch a guy and there's no more burst, explosion,
Yeah.
and it takes people a while to get off the name recognition, and especially if you play dynasty football leagues, it's that moment. Okay, it's time to sell. The returns on this
Yeah.
guy are going to be diminishing. So that's just how I think of like overrated, underrated. You mentioned Patrick Mahomes, and he's so exciting to watch. Like, I think his best attribute is not just his arm and his intelligence, is what he does when he's scrambling. It's so hard to tackle him. He's always keeping his eyes downfield. It's like 3rd and 12. You get a really good pass rush on him. He breaks through the pocket, and you're like, oh, you just know it's a conversion. And I say because like if you bet against him in that spot, but it's fantastic to watch. Who's your favorite player to watch in the NFL? It doesn't have to be a quarterback. It could be any position group. Who do you love watching play?
I mean, Patrick Mahomes is certainly up there. You talk about his scrambling, and he's not. I don't think people put him in the quote unquote athletic tier of quarterbacks like a Lamar Jackson or Jalen Hurts, who are getting a ton of design rushes, but he has that athleticism to escape the pocket and seemingly knows where the first down marker is every time and will run out a half a foot past it. I think a couple years ago it was Alvin Kamara. I mean, I think his balance and ability to just cut on a dime was incredible. I really like Chris Olave as well. I think a lot of this is driven by who I have on my fantasy football
Yeah, of
teams.
course.
I've had both of them, but um, I mean, Justin Jefferson is incredible the way that he plays as well. I don't know. I think that's what I was mentioning earlier is I've become a fan of more so of players than teams
Mm,
or teams themselves. Like being a Packers fan, I don't find it annoying how good Justin Jefferson is. Like you try to live in the moment and understand and watch like how great these players are
yeah.
and being able to watch them. Um, God, who else are my favorite players? I mean, like what Jameer Gibbs is doing is really fun to see. He's got a little bit of that Alvin Kamara in him, I think. Um, and then Christian McCaffrey too. Like he's just always fun to watch. Just the way he's able to line up outside in different spots and be able to just act like a wide receiver.
I love watching, and this is a rookie, but I love watching Devin Witherspoon. I love a corner that's willing to lay the boom down. I'm enjoying having Jalen Ramsey, and he gives me all the Jalen Ramsey vibes. He is a threat as a run defender as much as he is in coverage. I really, really enjoy Devin Witherspoon.
The other guy, now that you mentioned defensive side, is Max Crosby. I mean, he's so good. Like it's kind of a shame to for him to be on a team as poor as the Raiders right now, but you can tell that he's still out there enjoying it. Like he is wrecking games and is just a force. I mean, I don't know if he'll be in the DPOY conversation, but he is certainly and close to that tier of the top edge rushers.
And the fire he plays with. I love the jawing after the whistle. I love a guy who plays it right to the edge. Why do you think offensive football's, been bad this year? Like, have defenses just figured out a way to slow down offenses from getting the big play, or do you just think the level of quality of quarterback in the league is down right now?
I think it's a mixture of both. I mean, the fact that we've had what I think it's 10 rookie quarterbacks to have started at least one game, like as good as the prospects can be, whether it's CJ Stroud or Bryce Young, like they're still rookies. There are still going to be some growing pains for those guys, and to have 10 of them having started already is just kind of wild. I don't even know like how many total quarterbacks got drafted, like what the max is that we could hit this year.
It was 14. But some of the quarterbacks have been undrafted, so that number might not even be accurate.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think it's a little bit of that. I mean, you see even the way that the Chiefs offense operates, like they're certainly not on the same level that they've been the past couple of years. And I think it's again some of these bigger trends about, the too high safeties and things like that, and defense is starting to figure out how to account for some of these different offensive schemes is contributing to all of that. But I have to imagine that the quarterback play has a little bit more to do with that. Not only because we're getting less experienced guys, but the fact that they're coming in without a full offseason of preparation, or they're just coming off the street and things like that, not being able to have that same level of chemistry that you would have working with these guys for 3-4 months. So it's I hope, I mean, I can't handle another quarterback going down and to injury. Like again, even, obviously Joshua Dobbs has played pretty well for the Vikings in the last couple of days, but if the Vikings hadn't traded for him, like that offense would probably be sputtering as well, and it's just it would be a disaster in Minnesota.
Sam, you talked about, and I think in a lot of media gigs or in certain fields, sometimes you have to get lucky along the a road. Obviously, hard work puts you in positions to get lucky, but sometimes it's just getting opportunities, the right break, the right person likes you, the right conversation, the right timing. What is your future aspirations? Do you have an ultimate goal in mind, or do you just playing it by ear and however it flows?
I think I'm just playing it by ear right now. I mean, I've been in this industry full time, like I said, for 2 years now, and it's such a different environment than what I was quote unquote raised on, being in a business school, knowing like, okay, you're gonna start off in this program, you're gonna become a manager and then a director and then, enter the C suite. Like that was the theoretical natural stepping stones for your career. And not that those are all completely different now, but being in sports, like there's just not necessarily as much structure, which I think I enjoy a little bit more. And a lot of these companies are, unless you're working for like an ESPN or a CBS, they have a lot more of a startup feel,
Mhm.
which was very new to me 2 years ago when I started, because I was used to, okay, we're gonna have monthly development conversations, we're gonna do this and that, and they put a lot more on you because you need to again sort of lift yourself up, but there's also with that comes some of the freedom and flexibility to work on the things that you enjoy working on and things like that. So I haven't honestly thought about the future a ton. I did.
Job, like, I know Arjun wants to be a general manager or work in a front office. I would love to be Rich Eisen. That's a goal of mine. You don't have a job or a position that you're like, you know what? If I reach this in my life, this is something I'd be happy with.
Not right now. I mean, I know for sure, like, I don't want to go on the team side. Like that's just not a lifestyle that I really, as cool as it sounds, like I can't imagine those type of working hours and that level of dedication that you need. So I prefer being on the sort of content and analysis, consultation side of things, if you will, that I don't really have a desire to go work for a team. But yeah, right now I'm just like, I don't know, I'm just enjoying the moment and enjoying where I'm at. I'll figure out the future in a couple of years, I guess.
And no rush. You are one of the younger content creators out there, and with a bright future. I'm the old guy who figured it out in my mid to late 30s that this is a goal. So I'm thinking, all right, this is where I want to chart out, and maybe I'm less patient. But Sam, I've enjoyed it. I enjoy the work you do, the charts you put out. Keep doing all the great work, because guys like me really do appreciate it.
George, thank you very much. Like I said, really appreciate you bringing me on, talking a little football and about career journeys.
Thanks, Sam. That's it for me. Another edition of 90 Degrees is in the books. I want to thank my guest, Sam Hoppen, data scientist for Fantasy Pros, the sponsors of this podcast, Pinnacle and BetStamp, and my producer, Jason Cooper. Thanks for listening. Do me a favor before you go, like the content, subscribe, share, and comment. We'll be back next week with another guest on the 90 Degrees podcast, where we give an inside look into the sports betting industry. That's it for me. Hope you enjoyed. Until next time.